I want to review your grammar before your grammar test tomorrow. It might be easiest for you to print out the attachment that has these notes on it, or if you can't do that, view it on a computer screen so that it is a big enough screen for you to follow along. Okay, first of all, remember that a clause has a noun and a verb. It might be a complete sentence, it might be independent, or it might be dependent. Now, the independent clause, it's the main part of the sentence, and it makes a complete sentence all by itself. It expresses a complete thought. A dependent clause is also called a subordinate clause. So if we say dependent or subordinate, it's the same thing. Now, if you put a dependent clause down as a sentence, that wouldn't be a sentence. It would be a sentence fragment. It's going to have an independent clause with it. It cannot stand by itself. It depends on the independent clause. Now, a dependent clause, there are several different types. It could be a noun clause, an adjective clause, or an adverb clause. Let's talk first about dependent clauses, and let's talk about the adjective clauses. It always starts with a relative pronoun. Those are the words who, whom, whose, which, and that. For example, Jay found a book that he had lost. Now, an adjective clause will always describe or modify a noun. Remember, an adjective describes a noun, so does an adjective clause. So in this sentence above, that he had lost, it describes the book. Think of commas like handles that can take a clause out of a sentence. If you can take the clause out, then you're going to use the commas around it. So you could take it out and the sentence would still make just as much sense. Now, if it has to be in there, if the clause has to be in the sentence, we say it's restrictive. You have to have it there. There's a restriction. It's essential. It's absolutely essential to the sentence, or you won't understand it all. So if you must have the clause to understand whom you are talking about, it's going to be essential, also called restrictive. You can't take it out. You don't put the commas in it. Think of those commas as handles that let you take it out of a sentence. For example, let's look at this one. The man who sells popcorn isn't here today. We don't know which man you're talking about if you take out this who sells popcorn. You would say the man isn't here today. Which man? Hint, any clause that begins with that is going to be an essential clause. That can help you. Now let's look at non-restrictive or non-essential clauses for adjective clauses. If you are sure who's being talked about, even if you take that clause out, it is non-essential. It's non-restrictive. We don't have to have the clause. It's just extra information. Now, if we change this sentence that we had up here, the man who sells popcorn isn't here today. If we put his name in there, Mr. Jackson, who sells popcorn, isn't here today. The clause who sells popcorn isn't necessary. You could say Mr. Jackson isn't here today, and it would still make sense. You put in commas around it. Remember, they're like handles. They can take this clause right out of the sentence, and it still makes sense.